The ultimatum that shook Africa. Breaking news is unfolding at a speed that few could have imagined, and its impact is already reverberating far beyond the borders of any single nation. Across Africa, from bustling capitals to remote villages, conversations have stopped, phones have lit up, and attention has shifted to one dramatic and unprecedented confrontation that may redefine African politics for years to come. At the center of this storm stands Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader, a man who has rapidly transformed from a relatively unknown military officer into one of the most polarizing and talked-about figures on the African continent, in a move that analysts are already calling one of the boldest diplomatic challenges in modern African history. Traoré has issued a direct public ultimatum to Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni, demanding the immediate release of opposition leader Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu, known globally as Bobi Wine. This was not a routine diplomatic statement. It was not whispered behind closed doors. It was not delivered through cautious intermediaries. It was loud, direct, and unmistakably confrontational. Release Bobi Wine within 72 hours, or face consequences. Those words alone were enough to send shockwaves across diplomatic circles. But the deeper implications of this ultimatum run far beyond one man's freedom. What is unfolding is not simply a dispute between Burkina Faso and Uganda. It is a collision between generations, ideologies, and competing visions for Africa's future. To understand why this moment is so explosive, we must step back and examine how Africa arrived at this crossroads, and why so many eyes are now fixed on the countdown clock. A new voice from West Africa, Captain Ibrahim Traoré is only 35 years old, yet his rise has been nothing short of meteoric. When he seized power in Burkina Faso in September 2022, many observers initially dismissed him as another short-lived military figure in a country long plagued by coups and instability. But Traoré quickly proved that he was not interested in quietly managing the status quo. From the very beginning, his leadership was defined by defiance. He expelled French military forces that had operated in Burkina Faso for years under the banner of counterterrorism. He openly criticized Western economic arrangements that he described as exploitative and neo-colonial. He spoke directly to Africa's youth, framing his struggle not merely as a national revolution, but as part of a continental awakening. For millions of young Africans, many of whom have known only unemployment, political stagnation, and leaders who have ruled longer than they have been alive, Traoré's words struck a powerful chord. Social media amplified his speeches, his posture, and his unapologetic tone. To supporters, he became a symbol of resistance. To critics, a dangerous populist playing with fire. But regardless of perspective, one fact became undeniable. Ibrahim Traoré was not afraid to confront entrenched power. Until now, that confrontation had largely been aimed outward, at former colonial powers, global institutions, and Western governments. His ultimatum to Uganda marks a dramatic shift. African leaders challenging other African leaders openly and without diplomatic cushioning. That alone makes this moment historic. The man in the crosshairs, Yoweri Museveni. On the other side of this confrontation stands President Yoweri Museveni, a towering figure in East African politics who has ruled Uganda since 1986. When Museveni first came to power, he was celebrated as a reformer, a leader who promised stability after years of turmoil. Decades later, however, his image has transformed dramatically. To his supporters, Museveni is a stabilizing force, a seasoned statesman who has kept Uganda relatively secure in a volatile region. To his critics, he is the embodiment of Africa's forever presidents, leaders who manipulate constitutions, suppress opposition, and cling to power long after their legitimacy has eroded. Museveni's rule has been marked by constitutional amendments removing term and age limits, a powerful security apparatus, and repeated accusations of election manipulation. International observers have raised concerns for years, but meaningful consequences have rarely followed. This long-standing pattern of silence and accommodation is precisely what makes Traoré's ultimatum so disruptive. Bobi Wine, from music to movement. Caught in the middle of this confrontation is Bobi Wine, a man whose personal journey mirrors the aspirations and frustrations of an entire generation. Born in the slums of Kamwokya in Kampala, Bobi Wine rose to fame through music, using his lyrics to tell stories of poverty, injustice, and everyday struggle. His songs resonated deeply with Uganda's youth, who saw their own lives reflected in his words. But Bobi Wine did not stop at music. He entered politics, first as a member of parliament, and later as a presidential challenger in the 2021 elections. His campaign electrified the country. For the first time in years, Uganda's youth felt they had a candidate who spoke their language, literally and figuratively. The response from the state was swift and severe. Bobi Wine was arrested multiple times. His rallies were blocked. His supporters were detained. Human rights organizations documented allegations of torture, intimidation, and systematic repression. Though the government consistently denied wrongdoing, the pattern was impossible to ignore. To many Africans, Bobi Wine became more than a politician. He became a symbol of courage, defiance, and the high price of challenging entrenched authority. The moment everything changed. For years, most African leaders adhered to an unwritten rule, non-interference. No matter how severe the repression in a neighboring country, public criticism from fellow African heads of state was rare. Stability, unity, and sovereignty were prioritized, often at the expense of democratic principles. That silence shattered when Ibrahim Traoré stepped before the cameras in Ouagadougou. According to sources close to the Burkina Faso presidency, the emergency press conference was convened with little notice. Journalists expected a routine statement on security or economic policy. Instead, they witnessed a declaration that would dominate headlines across the continent. Traoré spoke not as a cautious diplomat, but as a revolutionary addressing history. He condemned the persecution of political voices. He criticized Africa's older leadership for standing by while dissent was crushed. And then, without hesitation, he named his target, President Museveni. The ultimatum was clear. The timeline was specific. The consequences were ominously undefined. Within minutes, the speech was circulating across social media. Within hours, hashtags demanding Bobi Wine's release were trending in dozens of African countries. Within a day, diplomats, analysts, and intelligence agencies around the world were scrambling to assess what this meant. Africa had entered uncharted territory. Why this is more than political theatre? Skeptics were quick to question Traoré's leverage. Burkina Faso faces serious security challenges. Jihadist insurgencies continue to destabilize large parts of the country. Economically, it is far from a continental heavyweight. So why did this ultimatum matter? Because power in modern politics is no longer measured only in tanks, GDP, or formal alliances. Narrative power, especially among young, digitally connected populations, has become a force of its own. Traoré's words tapped into a deep, shared frustration felt by millions of Africans who believe that their leaders no longer represent them. By framing Bobi Wine's imprisonment as a continental issue, Traoré transformed a national crisis into a generational cause. And that is where the real danger and potential lies. The clock starts ticking. As of this moment, nearly half of the 72-hour deadline has already passed. Behind closed doors, back-channel communications are reportedly underway. Regional mediators are scrambling. Governments that once preferred silence are being forced to choose between neutrality and principle. What happens when the deadline expires remains uncertain. Will Museveni make a calculated concession? Will Traoré escalate his challenge? Will other African leaders break their silence? One thing is already clear. Africa is watching itself in the mirror, confronting uncomfortable questions about power, accountability, and the future. And this is only the beginning. The hidden power plays and the rise of the new guard. While the world focused on the drama of Ibrahim Traoré's ultimatum, something far more complex was unfolding quietly beneath the surface. Diplomatic crises are rarely just about what is said publicly. They are shaped by networks, alliances, calculations, and preparations that often remain invisible until it is too late to ignore them. And this is where the story takes a far more serious turn. Because according to multiple sources across West and Central Africa, Traoré's confrontation with President Museveni did not come out of nowhere. It was not an impulsive speech fueled by emotion. It was the visible tip of a much larger political iceberg, one that has been forming slowly, deliberately, and in near total silence. At the heart of this hidden movement is something insiders are calling the New Guard. What is the New Guard? The New Guard is not a formal organization. There are no public charters, no official headquarters, no press releases announcing its existence. Instead, it operates as an informal but increasingly influential alignment of young African leaders, military figures, and political movements who share a common belief. Africa's post-independence political model is broken, and protecting it at all costs is no longer acceptable. According to confidential briefings obtained by regional observers, this loose coalition includes influential figures from Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and potentially Niger, alongside political opposition networks in countries like Senegal, Uganda, Nigeria, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. What binds them together is not ideology in the traditional sense. Some are military leaders, others are civilians. Some believe in strong centralized states. Others advocate grassroots democracy. But they all agree on one core principle. The era of leaders ruling indefinitely while silencing opposition must end. Traoré's role as a catalyst. Ibrahim Traoré has emerged as one of the most visible faces of this generational shift, not because he appointed himself leader of the New Guard, but because he was willing to say publicly what others were only discussing privately. In private meetings across West Africa over the past year, Traoré reportedly argued that African leaders had allowed the concept of sovereignty to become a shield for repression. According to one source familiar with these discussions, Traoré put it bluntly, "If sovereignty means protecting injustice, then sovereignty has lost its moral value." That philosophy explains why the ultimatum to Uganda was framed not as an act of aggression, but as an act of solidarity with African citizens rather than African governments. For the New Guard, Bobi Wine's imprisonment was not just a Ugandan issue. It was a symbol of a deeper continental disease. Why Bobi Wine became the line in the sand. There are many opposition figures across Africa facing harassment and detention, so why did Bobi Wine's case become the rallying point? The answer lies in visibility and symbolism. Bobi Wine is young, globally recognizable, and deeply connected to Africa's urban youth culture. His music crosses borders. His story resonates far beyond Uganda, and most importantly, he represents a non-violent challenge to power, one that relies on popular mobilization rather than armed struggle. For the New Guard, this made his persecution especially dangerous. If a figure like Bobi Wine could be systematically silenced without consequence, what message would that send to millions of young Africans who believe change can come through civic engagement rather than conflict? From Traoré's perspective, allowing Bobi Wine to rot in detention was not just unjust, it was strategically catastrophic for Africa's future. The African Union, from silence to pressure. One of the most significant potential consequences hinted at in Traoré's ultimatum involves the African Union, AU, an institution long criticised for its reluctance to confront authoritarian behaviour among its own members. According to insiders within ECOWAS and AU advisory circles, Traoré and his allies have been quietly preparing a formal challenge that could force the AU into an uncomfortable position. The proposal under discussion includes suspension of Uganda from select AU committees, review of Uganda's role in AU peacekeeping missions, formal inquiry into political repression and human rights violations. On paper, these steps may appear symbolic. In practice, they would be deeply damaging. Uganda's participation in peacekeeping missions, particularly in Somalia, provides both international legitimacy and substantial financial inflows. Any disruption to that role would ripple through Uganda's military, economy, and diplomatic standing. For decades, such measures were considered unthinkable. But the New Guard believes the political climate has changed. Economic leverage, the quiet weapon. Beyond institutional pressure lies a more subtle and potentially devastating tool: economic isolation. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea are increasingly coordinating economic strategies that bypass traditional Western frameworks. Gold, lithium, and other strategic resources are being renegotiated through alternative partnerships, particularly with non-Western actors. According to one economic analyst close to the negotiations, Traoré has been exploring the creation of preferential trade corridors that deliberately exclude governments seen as hostile to democratic reform. Uganda, a key transit country in East Africa, stands to lose significantly if regional trade routes are restructured around it. The message is simple but powerful. Political repression now carries an economic price. Uganda's calculated response. Uganda's official response to Traoré's ultimatum was swift and deliberately defiant. The Foreign Ministry's statement emphasized sovereignty, non-interference and national independence, but behind closed doors, sources suggest a far more nuanced conversation is taking place. Ugandan officials are reportedly weighing three competing risks: backing down, which could embolden domestic opposition; standing firm, which risks continental isolation; partial concessions, which could satisfy neither side fully. Museveni is an experienced political survivor. He understands that outright defiance may carry higher costs than ever before, not because of foreign powers, but because of African public opinion. And that is a new and dangerous variable, the real battle, narrative control. Perhaps the most underestimated aspect of this crisis is the battle for narrative dominance. On social media, Traoré's framing of the issue has gained enormous traction. Hashtags demanding Bobi Wine's release continue to trend. Youth-led movements across Africa are organizing online discussions, digital protests, and solidarity campaigns. In contrast, Uganda's government messaging, focused on legality and security, has struggled to resonate beyond official channels. This asymmetry matters. In the age of instant communication, legitimacy is no longer defined solely by state power. It is shaped by perception, emotional resonance, and moral clarity. And at the moment, Traore and the New Guard are winning that battle. A generational fault line. What we are witnessing is not simply a diplomatic dispute. It is a generational rupture. On one side stand leaders who came to power in the late 20th century, shaped by Cold War politics, liberation struggles, and centralized authority. On the other side stands a generation born into globalization, digital connectivity, and chronic disappointment with inherited systems. This confrontation has forced both sides into the open, and once that happens, there is no easy way back to silence. The stakes continue to rise as the ultimatum clock continues to tick. Pressure is mounting, not just on Uganda, but on every African leader who has quietly benefited from the old rule of non-interference. Neutrality is becoming harder to maintain. Silence is starting to look like complicity. Whether Traore ultimately follows through on his threats or not, the precedent has already been set. African leaders can challenge each other openly. African citizens can demand accountability beyond borders. And Africa's political future is no longer confined to closed rooms and quiet agreements. Economic warfare, apolitics, and the risk of continental division. As the ultimatum clock ticks down, the focus is no longer just on words, speeches, or symbolism. Behind the scenes, something far more consequential is taking shape, pressure mechanisms that could materially reshape Africa's political and economic landscape. This is where the confrontation between Ibrahim Traoré and Yoweri Museveni moves from dramatic rhetoric into dangerous territory, because when diplomacy fails, economics becomes the battlefield. Why economics matters more than military power. For decades, African political disputes were framed in terms of military strength, coups, or armed confrontation. But the New Guard understands something critical. In the modern African system, economic pressure is often more powerful and more destabilizing than force. Uganda may have a strong military. It may enjoy long-standing relationships with Western governments. But like most African economies, it is deeply dependent on regional trade routes, transit revenues, foreign investment confidence, multilateral institutional legitimacy. All four of these are now quietly under threat. The transit problem. Uganda's hidden vulnerability. Uganda's geographic position has long been one of its greatest advantages. Landlocked neighbours rely on regional corridors that pass through or near Ugandan territory. Transit fees, logistics hubs, and cross-border commerce generate hundreds of millions of dollars annually. According to regional trade analysts, Traoré and his allies have begun exploring alternative trade alignments that would strategically reroute commerce away from Uganda if political reforms are not made. This would not require sanctions. It would not require declarations of hostility. It would simply require cooperation among neighbouring states, and that is what makes it so dangerous. One source close to East African community discussions described it this way: if Uganda becomes politically radioactive, partners won't punish it openly. They'll just stop choosing it. That kind of quiet exclusion can cripple an economy faster than public sanctions ever could. Gold, resources, and a shifting economic order. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea are not economic giants, but they control strategic resources that matter far beyond their borders. Gold, lithium, manganese, and other critical materials are becoming increasingly central to global supply chains, particularly as the world transitions toward renewable energy and advanced technology.
Under Traoré's leadership, Burkina Faso has begun renegotiating extraction agreements and seeking partnerships outside traditional Western frameworks. This mirrors similar efforts in Mali and Guinea. The implication is clear. Political alignment is becoming economically relevant. Countries seen as resisting democratic accountability may find themselves excluded from new resource networks and trade partnerships. Uganda's leadership understands this risk, and it worries them. The African Union under unprecedented pressure. Perhaps no institution is more uncomfortable right now than the African Union. For years, the AU has balanced two conflicting principles: respect for national sovereignty, commitment to democratic norms and human rights. In practice, sovereignty usually won. But Traoré's ultimatum has forced the AU into a corner. If the AU ignores Uganda's internal repression, it risks losing credibility with Africa's youth. If it acts, it risks fracturing unity among member states. This is not a theoretical problem, it is happening in real time. Inside the AU, fault lines emerge. According to diplomats familiar with AU internal discussions, member states are quietly splitting into three camps. One, the status quo defenders. These are long-ruling governments that fear setting a precedent. Supporting Traoré could open the door to scrutiny of their own political practices. The reform sympathizers. And these states may not openly endorse Traoré's tactics, but they privately agree that political repression has gone too far and that silence is no longer sustainable. The pragmatists. Countries focus primarily on stability, trade and security. They fear that a generational confrontation could destabilize already fragile regions. This division alone threatens to weaken the AU at a time when Africa faces immense external pressures, from debt crises to climate shocks.
Peacekeeping, the unexpected lever. One of Uganda's most sensitive pressure points is its role in international peacekeeping, particularly in Somalia. Ugandan forces have been central to regional security efforts for years, earning international praise and substantial funding. Any move, formal or informal, to question Uganda's role would have enormous consequences. Traoré's allies are reportedly discussing whether political repression at home is compatible with peacekeeping responsibilities abroad. It is a question no one wanted to ask. Now it's on the table. The risk of a continental split. This is where the danger becomes existential. If African institutions fracture along generational or ideological lines, the continent risks entering a period of internal polarization that could weaken collective bargaining power globally. Some analysts warn that a divided AU would be easier for external powers to manipulate, exactly the opposite of what Traoré claims to want. Others argue that avoiding conflict at all costs has already weakened Africa, and that confrontation is a necessary step toward renewal. There is no consensus, and that uncertainty is fueling anxiety across diplomatic circles. Uganda's strategic dilemma. President Museveni now faces one of the most complex decisions of his long career. Backing down could encourage opposition movements, undermine the image of control, signal vulnerability. Standing firm could trigger economic isolation, damage regional standing, turn Bobi Wine into a continental martyr. Every option carries risk, and the longer Museveni waits, the narrower those options become. A turning point for African solidarity. For decades, African solidarity often meant protecting leaders from criticism. Traoré is proposing a radically different definition: solidarity with citizens rather than governments. Whether one agrees with him or not, this idea has already escaped the realm of theory. Young Africans are debating it. Activists are organizing around it. Leaders are being forced to respond to it. Once solidarity changes meaning, the political map changes with it. The countdown continues. As this part of the story closes, one truth stands out. The ultimatum has already achieved something irreversible. It has exposed vulnerabilities. It has activated networks. It has broken a long-standing silence. Even if no formal punishment follows, even if compromises are made behind closed doors, the psychological barrier has been shattered. African leaders now know they can be challenged, not by foreign powers, but by their own continent. And that knowledge is dangerous. Global powers step in. The US, Europe, China and Russia watch closely. What began as an African confrontation is no longer confined to the continent. By the time Ibrahim Traoré's ultimatum crossed the halfway mark, it had already landed on the desks of policymakers in Washington, London, Brussels, Beijing and Moscow. Intelligence briefings were updated, diplomatic cables multiplied, quiet consultations replaced public statements. Because while African leaders may be the visible actors in this drama, Global powers have enormous stakes in how it ends, and each of them is approaching this crisis with a very different set of calculations. The United States. Values versus strategy. For the United States, Uganda has long been viewed as a strategic partner in East Africa. Ugandan troops play a major role in regional security operations, particularly in Somalia. Washington has also relied on Kampala as a stabilizing force in a volatile region. At the same time, US officials have repeatedly expressed concern about democratic backsliding in Uganda, especially after the 2021 elections. This creates a familiar but uncomfortable dilemma. Support democracy too aggressively and risk destabilizing a key security partner. Prioritize stability and appear hypocritical on human rights. Traore's ultimatum has intensified that dilemma. According to diplomatic sources, the U.S. State Department is now debating whether silence would be interpreted as tacit support for repression, or worse, as opposition to Africa-led accountability. One senior analyst summarized the mood this way. This is awkward. A military leader is saying out loud what we've been saying quietly for years. That irony has not gone unnoticed. Europe. Fear of precedent. European governments, particularly France and the United Kingdom, are watching the situation with visible unease. France's relationship with Burkina Faso has deteriorated sharply since Traore expelled French forces. Paris views Traore not only as a political challenge, but as a symbol of diminishing European influence in parts of Africa. The idea of Traore positioning himself as a moral authority on democracy while ruling through a military government deeply unsettles European policymakers. At the same time, European institutions have documented human rights concerns in Uganda for years. Publicly opposing Traore would require implicitly defending Museveni's record, an uncomfortable position. As a result, Europe's response so far has been cautious, restrained, and deliberately vague. But behind the scenes, European diplomats are increasingly worried about precedent. If African leaders begin openly sanctioning one another over internal politics, Europe's traditional leverage through aid conditionality and diplomatic pressure could erode. China's stability, above all, China's position is, as usual, pragmatic and quietly influential. Beijing has major infrastructure investments in both Uganda and Burkina Faso, including roads, energy projects, and mining interests. Instability in either country threatens long-term returns. Officially, China maintains its long-standing policy of non-interference. Public statements emphasize dialogue, sovereignty, and mutual respect. But sources familiar with Chinese diplomatic thinking say Beijing is deeply concerned about contagion. Not contagion of protests, but of political unpredictability. If generational confrontations spread, investment environments become harder to manage, contracts become riskier, long-term planning becomes uncertain. For China, the ideal outcome is a quiet compromise that restores stability without empowering mass movements that could later challenge Chinese-backed governments elsewhere. Russia, opportunity and disruption. Russia's approach is markedly different. Over the past several years, Moscow has expanded its influence in parts of West and Central Africa, particularly where Western influence has declined. This has included security cooperation, military training, and political alignment. For Russian strategists, Traore's challenge to the old African order represents both risk and opportunity. Risk because instability can spiral beyond control. Opportunity because fractured alliances create space for new power brokers. Some analysts believe Moscow could attempt to position itself as a mediator, offering diplomatic support to whichever side aligns more closely with its interests. Others suggest Russia may simply let tensions rise, calculating that a weakened African Union and strained Western relationships serve its broader geopolitical goals. Either way, Moscow is watching carefully. Why global silence matters. One of the most striking aspects of this crisis is what global powers have not done. There has been no strong condemnation of Traore's ultimatum. No outright defense of Museveni's actions. No decisive intervention to de-escalate publicly. This silence is not accidental. It reflects uncertainty. No major power wants to misjudge the mood of Africa's youth, particularly at a time when global influence on the continent is already being questioned. In many capitals, the fear is the same: support the wrong side and lose Africa's next generation entirely. Africa's youth, the unignorable force. If global leaders needed proof that this confrontation mattered beyond elite politics, They found it online. Across social media platforms, African youth have turned Traoré's ultimatum into a rallying point. Videos, debates and live discussions are spreading rapidly. For many young Africans, this is the first time they have seen an African leader openly challenge another over democratic principles, and that matters. One Kenyan commentator put it bluntly, "For once, this isn't Europe telling Africa how to behave, it's Africa talking to itself." That distinction has dramatically changed the tone of the conversation. Back-channel diplomacy heats up. As public statements remain restrained, back-channel diplomacy is intensifying. Mediators from Tanzania, South Africa and Rwanda are reportedly engaging both Kampala and Ouagadougou. The goal is simple: prevent escalation while preserving face on all sides. Potential compromise options being discussed include conditional release or eased restrictions on Bobi Wine, third-party monitoring of political freedoms, quiet commitments to political dialogue in Uganda. None of these options are guaranteed to satisfy Traoré or Africa's youth, but they reflect growing pressure to find a way out, the cost of doing nothing. Perhaps the most dangerous option for global powers is inaction. If Museveni refuses to move and Traoré escalates, silence will look like complicity. If Traoré backs down without results, silence will look like abandonment of democratic ideals. Either outcome risks accelerating the erosion of trust between African populations and international institutions. And once trust is lost, it is extremely difficult to rebuild. The world holds its breath as this part of the story closes when reality is undeniable. This confrontation has exposed the limits of global influence in Africa. External powers can advise. They can pressure quietly. They can offer incentives. But the driving force of this moment is African and generational. What happens next will not be decided in Washington, Brussels, Beijing, or Moscow alone. It will be decided in African capitals, African streets, and African conversations, and the countdown continues. Africa's youth uprising, streets, screens, and a new political reality. While presidents calculate, diplomats negotiate, and global powers hedge their bets, a different force is already moving, faster, louder, and far less predictable: Africa's youth. They are not waiting for official statements. They are not waiting for elections. They are not waiting for permission. And in this confrontation between Ibrahim Traoré and Yoweri Museveni, they have found something rare, a moment that feels like recognition. The digital explosion. Within hours of Traoré's ultimatum, African social media spaces transformed into political battlegrounds. Hashtags demanding Bobi Wine's release spread across platforms. Live-stream discussions drew tens of thousands of viewers. Influencers, artists, student groups, and activists amplified Traoré's words, sometimes critically, often passionately, but almost always intensely. What made this different from previous online waves was scale and coordination. This was not confined to Uganda. It was not confined to West Africa. It was continental. Young Africans from Accra to Addis Ababa, Lagos to Nairobi, Johannesburg to Dakar were debating the same question. Can African leaders finally hold each other accountable? Why youth identified with this moment? For many young Africans, politics has long felt distant and rigged, controlled by leaders who came to power decades ago and refused to let go. Traoré's challenge disrupted that narrative. Even critics who dislike military rule acknowledged something important. He spoke a language young Africans recognized. He talked about dignity. He talked about courage. He talked about refusing to stay silent. Bobi Wine's story already embodied those ideas. Traoré's ultimatum connected them to power at the highest level. For a generation that feels invisible, that connection mattered deeply. From online to offline, digital energy rarely stays digital forever. Within days, solidarity actions began emerging. Small student demonstrations on university campuses, peaceful marches organized by civil society groups, music-led gatherings where Bobi Wine's songs became protest anthems. In Uganda, security forces remained on high alert. Any sign of mass mobilization was treated as a potential threat, but the real shift was psychological. People were no longer asking if change was possible. They were asking when. The fear of contagion. This is what worries long-ruling governments the most. Not Traoré himself, not Bobi Wine alone, but the idea spreading between them, the idea that silence is not unity, sovereignty is not immunity, Youth voices cannot be permanently suppressed. Authoritarian systems survive by isolating dissent. This moment is doing the opposite. It is connecting dissent across borders, elders versus the next generation. Not everyone is celebrating. Across Africa, many older citizens express unease. They remember coups, civil wars, and instability. To them, confrontation, especially between states, feels dangerous. Some argue that change must come slowly. Others fear youth movements lack structure and patience. This generational divide is real and unresolved. But what makes this moment unique is that the younger generation is no longer waiting for approval from the older one. The power of symbols. Bobi Wine is no longer just a detained opposition leader. He has become a symbol of possibility and risk. If he is released, even partially, it will be seen as proof that pressure works. If he remains imprisoned, he risks becoming a martyr, something governments work desperately to avoid. Traore understood this calculus. Symbols move people faster than policies ever could. Hours, but years of consequences. As the deadline approaches, emotions are intensifying. Hope is colliding with anxiety, excitement with fear, belief with realism. Whatever happens when the clock runs out, one thing is certain. This generation has crossed a mental threshold. They have seen an African leader speak to their frustrations openly. They have seen silence broken. They have seen power challenged from within the continent. That cannot be unseen. A new political reality. The old model assumed African youth would disengage, migrate, or adapt quietly. This moment suggests otherwise. They are watching. They are organizing. They are learning quickly. And they are beginning to understand their collective power, not just nationally, but continentally. The question no one can avoid. As we reach this stage of the story, the central question is no longer only about Bobi Wine or Uganda. It is this: what happens when Africa's youth decide they will no longer accept politics as usual? No leader, old or new, can ignore that question for long. The deadline, the scenarios, and Africa at a crossroads. As the 72-hour deadline approaches its final stretch, the atmosphere across Africa is thick with anticipation. This is no longer just a news story. It feels like a countdown to a turning point. Phones buzz non-stop in presidential offices. Emergency meetings stretch late into the night. Diplomats speak in coded language. Activists refresh their feeds every few minutes. Time itself has become political. And now the question everyone is asking is simple but terrifying in its implications. What happens when the clock hits zero? Scenario 1. A calculated concession. The first and least explosive scenario is a controlled compromise. In this version of events, President Museveni does not openly bow to pressure, but he makes a move just big enough to defuse the crisis. This could include releasing Bobi Wine under strict conditions, easing restrictions on his movement, dropping or delaying charges, allowing limited political activity. Such a move would be framed as a legal or humanitarian decision, not a response to Traore. For Museveni, this preserves authority while reducing immediate pressure. For Traore, it allows him to claim victory without escalating further. For African youth, it would be proof that pressure, especially African pressure, can work. But this path comes with a hidden cost. Once concessions are made once, they become possible again. Scenario 2. The bluff is called. The second scenario is far more dangerous. Museveni refuses to move. No relief, no compromise, no acknowledgement. In this case, Traore faces a defining test. If he does nothing, his credibility collapses, not just personally, but for the entire idea of the new guard. If he acts, Africa enters uncharted territory. Possible escalations include formal motions at the African Union, coordinated diplomatic isolation, economic pressure through trade realignment, continent-wide youth mobilization. This would not be a clean confrontation. It would be messy,
prolonged, and deeply polarizing. Africa would be forced to choose sides, openly or quietly. Scenario 3. The unpredictable wild card. African politics rarely follows clean scripts. A third scenario looms, the unexpected event that changes everything. This could be another African leader breaking ranks publicly, a dramatic development inside Uganda, international sanctions or incentives shifting the balance, internal fractures within ruling elites. History shows that moments like this rarely resolve exactly as predicted. Sometimes power cracks from the inside. Traore's gamble. For Ibrahim Traoré, this moment defines his legacy far beyond Burkina Faso. If he follows through, he becomes the face of a new confrontational Pan-Africanism. If he retreats, critics will label him reckless or performative. But even retreat would not erase what he has already done. He has changed the rules of engagement. African leaders now know silence is a choice. Youth opinion matters. Continental accountability is no longer taboo. That knowledge alone shifts the balance of power. Museveni's long game. Museveni has survived pressure before from rebels, donors, critics and voters. But this challenge is different. It does not come from the West. It does not come from armed insurgents. It comes from within Africa itself, and from a generation that does not fear him the way previous ones did. Even if Museveni holds firm, the cost of maintaining control will rise. And rising costs always change calculations. The bigger question: what kind of Africa emerges? Beyond personalities and deadlines lies the real issue. Is Africa entering an era where leaders answer to citizens beyond borders? Youth movements coordinate continent-wide? Sovereignty coexists with accountability? Or will the old order reassert itself, stronger, more defensive, and more repressive? This confrontation is a test case. Future leaders are watching closely. History in real time. Moments like this are rare, not because conflict is rare, but because meaningful choice is rare. Africa has reached one of those moments. Whatever happens next will be studied, debated, and remembered, not just for what was done, but for what could have been done. The final truth: whether Bobi Wine walks free tomorrow or remains behind restrictions, one reality is already locked in. Africa's political conversation has changed. Youth are no longer silent, leaders are no longer untouchable, and accountability is no longer a foreign concept imposed from outside. It is being demanded from within. The countdown may end, but the consequences are just beginning.
Legacy, long-term impact, and the future of African democracy. When historians look back on moments that reshape continents, they rarely focus only on outcomes. They study shifts in thinking, changes in behavior, and the moments when people collectively realize that the rules they once accepted no longer apply. This confrontation between Ibrahim Traoré and Yoweri Museveni, sparked by the fate of Bobi Wine, will be remembered not only for what happened at the deadline, but for what it revealed about Africa itself, because something fundamental has already changed. The end of comfortable silence. For decades, African politics was governed by a quiet agreement. Leaders would not openly challenge one another's internal affairs. That silence was often defended as unity. In reality, it became protection. Protection for leaders who overstayed their welcome. Protection for systems that crushed opposition quietly. Protection for stagnation, disguised as stability. Traoré's ultimatum shattered that comfort. Regardless of how one judges his methods, he exposed a truth many preferred not to confront. Silence had become a political weapon, and once that silence was broken, it could never be fully restored. Bobi Wine's place in history. Bobi Wine's personal fate, whether release, restriction, or continued persecution, matters deeply, but his place in history is already secured. He represents a new type of African political figure, not born from armed struggle, not elevated by foreign powers, not shaped by Cold War alliances. He emerged from culture, from music, from lived experience. That alone makes him dangerous to old systems. Even if Bobi Wine never holds executive power, his influence has already reshaped political imagination across Africa. Millions now believe leadership does not have to look the way it always has. And belief is the seed of transformation. Traoré's true legacy, Ibrahim Traoré, will be debated fiercely. Some will call him courageous, others will call him reckless. Some will accuse him of hypocrisy as a military leader speaking about democracy.
All of those arguments will persist, but history will likely remember him for one undeniable act. He forced Africa to talk to itself honestly, not through Western pressure, not through donor conditions, but through African voice confronting African power. That alone places him at a pivotal point in the continent's political evolution. The old God's warning. Long-ruling leaders across Africa have taken note, not necessarily of Traoré's ideology, but of the reaction. They have seen youth mobilize across borders, narratives escape state control, silence turn into vulnerability. Many will respond by tightening control. Others may cautiously reform. Some will attempt cosmetic change, but none can claim ignorance anymore. The ground has shifted. A generation that will not unlearn. Perhaps the most important outcome of this moment has nothing to do with presidents at all. It has to do with memory. Africa's youth have now seen an African leader challenge another openly. Continental solidarity form around a democratic demand. Power questioned without permission. They will not unsee that. Even if this moment fades from headlines, it will live on in expectations. And expectations, once raised, are almost impossible to lower. The future, confrontation or transformation. Africa now stands at a fork in the road. One path leads to deeper repression, as leaders attempt to suppress rising demands through force and fear. The other leads to transformation, uneven, uncomfortable, but ultimately more sustainable. History suggests the first path eventually collapses under its own weight. The second is harder, but it lasts. Which path Africa chooses will not be decided by one ultimatum, one leader, or one election. It will be decided by millions of daily choices: to speak or stay silent, to demand or endure, to imagine or surrender. The final takeaway: this was never just about Uganda. It was never just about Burkina Faso. It was never just about Bobi Wine. It was about whether Africa's future belongs to inherited power or earned legitimacy. The clock may stop, the headlines may move on, but the question remains, and Africa's youth are no longer willing to wait quietly for the answer. Closing words, narration style. This is how history changes. Not all at once, not cleanly, but through moments that force uncomfortable truths into the open. A revolutionary leader spoke. A long-standing ruler was challenged. A musician became a symbol. A generation found its voice. Whatever happens next, Africa will never be exactly the same again.